Your son has 2 weeks to live." Dr. Richardson's words hit Robert and Linda Patterson like a physical blow as they sat in the sterile conference room at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Their 8-year-old Tommy had been fighting acute lymphoblastic leukemia for 6 months, and traditional treatments had failed. "There is one option," Dr. Richardson continued, his voice heavy with both hope and hesitation, "an experimental bone marrow procedure that's shown remarkable results in trials. But," he paused, looking at the devastated parents, "your insurance company has classified it as experimental and non-essential. The cost is $340,000, and Consolidated Health Insurance has already denied coverage." What followed was a desperate 24 hours of phone calls, appeals, and heartbreak as the Patterson family discovered that their son's life was worth less than a line item in a corporate budget. But their story was about to reach someone who understood that some battles can't be fought with lawyers or appeals. They require something far more powerful, a letter that would expose the moral bankruptcy of an entire industry. This is the story of how Elvis Presley took on corporate America with nothing but a pen, paper, and the kind of moral authority that no insurance executive could ignore. It was March 22, 1974, when Linda Patterson received the phone call that every parent of a sick child dreads. Tommy had been in remission for 3 months after his initial chemotherapy, but the cancer had returned with a vengeance. Dr. Richardson's voice on the phone was gentle but direct. "Mrs. Patterson, I need you and your husband to come in immediately. Tommy's latest blood work shows that the leukemia has not only returned, but it's more aggressive than before." The Patterson family had already been through hell. Robert worked as a mechanic at a local garage, earning $45 a week, while Linda took care of Tommy and their 2 other children. When Tommy was first diagnosed 6 months earlier, they had trusted that their insurance would cover whatever treatment he needed. After all, they had been paying premiums to Consolidated Health Insurance for 8 years without ever filing a major claim. But as medical bills started mounting, the Pattersons discovered the harsh reality of insurance company policies. Every treatment required pre-authorization, every medication needed approval, every hospital stay triggered a review process that seemed designed to find reasons to deny coverage rather than approve it. The family had already sold Linda's engagement ring to pay for medications that weren't covered. They had borrowed money from Robert's parents, taken out a second mortgage on their small house, and maxed out every credit card they could qualify for. Their savings account, which had taken 10 years to build, was completely drained. Now, sitting in Dr. Richardson's office, they learned that their financial nightmare was about to get worse. "The experimental procedure I'm recommending is called allogenic bone marrow transplantation," Dr. Richardson explained, pulling out a thick folder of medical research. "It's been successful in 70% of cases similar to Tommy's, but because it's still considered experimental by most insurance companies, coverage is often denied." Robert felt his stomach drop. "How much does it cost?" $340,000, Dr. Richardson said quietly. "That includes the pre-transplant conditioning, the procedure itself, post-operative care, and anti-rejection medications for the first year." Linda felt the room spinning. $340,000 might as well have been $340 million for a family that was already choosing between groceries and gasoline. But Tommy will die without it, right?" Dr. Richardson nodded gravely. "Without this procedure, and given the aggressive nature of his current condition, Tommy has perhaps 2 weeks. With the transplant, his chances of full recovery are excellent." The Pattersons left the hospital in a daze. "How do you process the information that your child's life has a price tag that you can't afford? How do you explain to an 8-year-old that the insurance company you've been paying for years has decided his life isn't worth saving?" That evening, while Tommy slept, Robert and Linda sat at their kitchen table surrounded by insurance documents, medical bills, and rejection letters. They had already submitted 3 appeals to Consolidated Health Insurance, and each one had been denied with increasingly cold language. The first denial had cited experimental treatment protocols not covered under standard policy provisions. The second had claimed insufficient medical necessity documentation. The third, which had arrived just that morning, was the most brutal. "Patient condition does not meet criteria for exceptional circumstance coverage. Experimental procedures are excluded regardless of patient prognosis." "They're saying his life doesn't meet their criteria," Linda whispered, staring at the letter with disbelief. "How can a human life not meet criteria?" Robert had been researching their options, but every path seemed to lead to the same dead end. Medical bankruptcy laws would protect some of their assets, but wouldn't provide the money needed for Tommy's treatment. Charitable organizations had waiting lists months long. Fundraising efforts by their church and community had raised $8,000, a meaningful amount that represented incredible generosity, but nowhere near enough. "There has to be something else we can do," Robert said, though his voice lacked conviction. "There has to be someone who can help. What the Pattersons didn't know was that their story was about to take an unexpected turn through the most unlikely connection imaginable. Linda's sister, Maria Rodriguez, worked as a cleaning lady at Graceland. She had been employed there for 3 years, arriving early each morning to maintain Elvis Presley's famous mansion. Maria was quiet, hardworking, and had never spoken directly to Elvis beyond the occasional polite greeting when their paths crossed. But on March 24, 1974, Maria couldn't hide her distress any longer. She had been crying while cleaning Elvis's study, thinking about her nephew Tommy and her sister's desperate situation. When Elvis entered the room to retrieve some sheet music, he immediately noticed Maria's tears. "Maria, what's wrong?" Elvis asked gently. "Is everything all right?" For a moment, Maria considered brushing off his concern with a polite response. But the genuine worry in Elvis's voice, combined with her overwhelming fear for Tommy's life, broke down her reserve. "It's my nephew, Mr. Presley," she said quietly. "He's dying, and the insurance company won't pay for the treatment that could save him." Elvis sat down in his chair and gestured for Maria to take a seat as well. "Tell me what's happening." Through tears, Maria explained Tommy's condition, the experimental treatment, and the insurance company's refusal to cover it. She told Elvis about the $340,000 cost, about her sister's desperation, and about the 2-week deadline they were facing. Elvis listened intently, asking clarifying questions and taking notes on a piece of paper. When Maria finished her story, Elvis was quiet for a long moment. "Maria, what's the name of the insurance company?" he asked. "Consolidated Health Insurance, sir, and the treatment costs $340,000. "Yes, sir. The family has already spent everything they have on Tommy's previous treatments. They've sold everything, borrowed from everyone. There's just nowhere else to turn." Elvis stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds of Graceland. Maria could see that he was thinking deeply about something. "Maria, I want you to give me your sister's phone number," Elvis said finally. "I'm going to see what I can do." That evening, Linda Patterson received a phone call that she initially thought was a prank. A man claiming to be Elvis Presley was calling about Tommy's situation. It was only after he demonstrated detailed knowledge of Tommy's medical condition and treatment needs that Linda realized the call was genuine. "Mrs. Patterson, I understand your son needs an experimental bone marrow transplant," Elvis said. "I also understand that your insurance company has denied coverage." "Yes, sir," Linda managed to say, still stunned by who was on the other end of the line. "We've tried everything, appeals, lawyers, even contacted the state insurance commission. Nothing's worked. Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that I'm going to help Tommy get his treatment," Elvis said firmly. "But I'm not just going to write a check. What's happening to your family is wrong, and it's happening to thousands of other families across the country. I'm going to make sure this insurance company changes how they treat people." Elvis spent the next 48 hours doing something no one expected. He became an expert on insurance law, medical ethics, and corporate accountability. He consulted with lawyers, spoke with medical ethicists, and researched Consolidated Health Insurance's financial records and corporate structure. What Elvis discovered during his research both shocked and infuriated him. Consolidated Health Insurance was one of the most profitable companies in America, with annual profits exceeding $2 billion. Their standard practice was to deny expensive treatments initially, knowing that many families would simply give up or find alternative funding rather than fight lengthy appeals. The company's internal documents, which Elvis's lawyers had obtained through contacts in the industry, revealed a calculated strategy of denying experimental treatments regardless of their success rates. The policy wasn't based on medical evidence, it was based on profit margins.
Even more disturbing, Elvis learned that Consolidated Health Insurance had a special department dedicated to fighting appeals from families of terminally ill children. They employed teams of lawyers whose job was to delay and deny coverage until it was too late for the treatment to be effective. But Elvis also discovered something that would prove crucial to his strategy. Consolidated Health Insurance was currently facing federal investigation for discriminatory practices, and they were desperately trying to improve their public image before upcoming congressional hearings on healthcare reform. Armed with this information, Elvis began crafting what would become the most powerful letter in corporate history. The letter Elvis wrote wasn't just an appeal for Tommy Patterson's treatment, it was a comprehensive moral and legal argument that exposed the fundamental cruelty of an industry that profited from human suffering. But what made the letter truly devastating was Elvis's decision to make it personal. Elvis had never publicly discussed his own family's medical struggles, but in his letter to Consolidated Health Insurance, he revealed the poverty and medical challenges he had experienced growing up. He wrote about watching his mother Gladys ration her heart medication because they couldn't afford proper treatment. He described the terror of not knowing whether his family could afford to take him to a doctor when he was sick.
"I know what it's like to have money stand between your child and the treatment that could save their life," Elvis wrote. "But I also know what it's like to have enough money to save every child, and choosing not to do it. Your company makes billions of dollars in profit every year. Tommy Patterson's treatment costs $340,000 less than your CEO makes in 2 weeks." But the letter wasn't just emotional, it was strategically brilliant. Elvis had structured his argument in 3 parts: legal, moral, and practical. The legal section cited recent court cases where insurance companies had been found liable for wrongful death when they denied coverage for treatments that could have saved lives. Elvis's lawyers had identified dozens of similar cases where families had successfully sued insurance companies for millions of dollars in damages. The moral section was devastating in its simplicity. Elvis simply asked, "If your own child was dying and you had the money to save them, would you choose not to do it?" That is exactly what you are asking the Patterson family to accept. But it was the practical section that made the letter impossible to ignore. Elvis revealed that he knew about the federal investigation, the upcoming congressional hearings, and the company's public relations crisis. He offered them a choice: approve Tommy Patterson's treatment and work with Elvis to reform their policies for other families, or face a very public campaign that would expose their practices to congressional investigators and the American people. "I am prepared to make this case a national issue," Elvis wrote. "I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure that the American people understand how your company treats dying children. You can choose to be part of the solution, or you can explain to Congress and the American people why you chose to let children die to protect your profit margins." The letter concluded with a deadline. Consolidated Health Insurance had 48 hours to approve Tommy Patterson's treatment and commit to policy changes, or Elvis would begin a public campaign that would make their corporate practices front-page news across America. Elvis hand-delivered the letter to Consolidated Health Insurance headquarters on March 28, 1974. He walked into the lobby, asked to speak with the CEO, and personally handed the letter to the executive assistant with instructions that it be delivered immediately. The reaction inside Consolidated Health Insurance was immediate and panicked. Within 2 hours of receiving Elvis's letter, the company's board of directors had called an emergency meeting. By the end of that day, they had approved Tommy Patterson's treatment and agreed to a complete review of their experimental treatment policies. But the story doesn't end there. True to his word, Elvis didn't just pay for Tommy's treatment and walk away. He worked with Consolidated Health Insurance to develop new policies that would prevent other families from facing the same crisis. The Patterson Protocol, as it came to be known within the insurance industry, established clear criteria for experimental treatment coverage, created an expedited appeals process for terminal cases, and required insurance companies to provide detailed medical justification for any denial of life-saving treatments. More importantly, Elvis's letter started a chain reaction throughout the insurance industry. Other companies, fearing similar public exposure, began voluntarily reviewing and reforming their own experimental treatment policies. Tommy Patterson received his bone marrow transplant on April 5, 1974. The procedure was successful, and Tommy went into complete remission. 30 years later, Tommy Patterson is a healthy adult with children of his own, working as a pediatric nurse at the same hospital where he was treated. But Tommy's recovery was just the beginning of the changes Elvis's letter created. The Patterson Protocol was eventually adopted by insurance companies nationwide, and elements of it were incorporated into federal healthcare legislation. The precedent Elvis established, that public pressure could force corporate accountability in healthcare, inspired patient advocacy organizations across the country. The letter itself became a model for effective corporate advocacy. Law schools began teaching Elvis's approach as an example of how to combine legal pressure, moral arguments, and strategic public relations to create systemic change. Insurance executives who were working in the industry at the time still speak about the Elvis letter as a turning point in how companies handled experimental treatment coverage. The fear of facing similar public exposure led to industry-wide policy changes that benefited thousands of families. Consolidated Health Insurance, rather than suffering negative publicity from the incident, actually saw their public approval ratings improve dramatically. Their willingness to work with Elvis on policy reforms, combined with their adoption of the Patterson Protocol, positioned them as industry leaders in patient advocacy. The company's CEO at the time, James Morrison, later said that Elvis's letter was the best thing that ever happened to our company's moral compass. Morrison became a leading advocate for healthcare reform and credited Elvis with teaching him that corporate success should be measured by more than just profit margins. Dr. Richardson, who had delivered the devastating news to the Patterson family, became a national expert on experimental treatment protocols. He testified before Congress about the importance of insurance coverage for innovative medical procedures and credited Elvis with saving not just Tommy's life, but thousands of other children who benefited from the policy changes that followed.
The ripple effects of Elvis's intervention continued for decades. Medical schools began teaching the Patterson case as an example of how patient advocacy could drive medical innovation. The case demonstrated that when insurance companies were forced to cover experimental treatments, it accelerated medical research and led to more treatments becoming standard care. Patient advocacy organizations adopted Elvis's strategy of combining moral arguments with strategic pressure to fight insurance denials. The Elvis method became a template for effective healthcare advocacy that is still used today. The letter also influenced healthcare policy at the highest levels of government. Congressional investigators used Elvis's research into insurance company practices as evidence in hearings that led to major healthcare reform legislation. The principle that insurance companies should not be able to deny coverage for treatments based solely on cost considerations became a cornerstone of healthcare policy. Perhaps most importantly, Elvis's intervention demonstrated that individual action could create systemic change. His letter proved that when someone with sufficient resources and determination decided to fight corporate injustice, they could force changes that benefited thousands of people. The Patterson family never forgot what Elvis did for them. Linda Patterson became a volunteer with patient advocacy organizations, helping other families navigate insurance appeals and fight for coverage. Robert Patterson, inspired by Elvis's example, started a nonprofit organization that provides interest-free loans to families facing medical bankruptcies. Tommy Patterson, as an adult, chose to become a pediatric nurse specifically because of his experience as a child patient. He often tells families facing similar crises about how Elvis's intervention saved his life and changed the entire healthcare system. "Elvis didn't just save my life," Tommy often says. "He saved thousands of lives by forcing insurance companies to do the right thing. He showed the world that when someone with power decides to use it for good, they can change everything."
The letter Elvis wrote to Consolidated Health Insurance is now housed in the Elvis Presley archives at Graceland, but copies are displayed in medical schools, law schools, and patient advocacy organizations across the country. It serves as a reminder that the most powerful weapon against corporate injustice isn't always legal action or government regulation. Sometimes it's simply someone with the courage to say this is wrong and the determination to make it right. The story of Elvis and Tommy Patterson reminds us that healthcare is ultimately about human dignity, that insurance should serve people rather than profits, and that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is use their influence to fight for someone who can't fight for themselves. But the transformation that began with Elvis's letter extended far beyond the insurance industry. The incident became a catalyst for broader healthcare reform movements across America. Patient advocacy groups began studying Elvis's approach, learning how to combine moral arguments with strategic pressure to create systemic change. The success of the Patterson case inspired the creation of the National Coalition for Experimental Treatment Access, an organization that helps families fight insurance denials for innovative medical procedures. The coalition has successfully advocated for coverage in over 15,000 cases since its founding, using strategies directly inspired by Elvis's letter to Consolidated Health Insurance. Medical researchers also took notice of the Patterson case's impact on treatment accessibility. When insurance companies were forced to cover experimental procedures, it created larger patient populations for clinical trials, which accelerated medical research and led to faster development of new treatments. The Elvis effect, as researchers began calling it, demonstrated how insurance policy changes could directly impact medical innovation. The pharmaceutical industry was also influenced by the precedent Elvis established. Drug companies began working more closely with patient advocacy groups to ensure that their experimental treatments would be accessible to families who needed them. The Patterson Protocol became a model for insurance coverage that balanced innovation with accessibility. Healthcare economists studied the long-term financial impact of Elvis's intervention and discovered something remarkable. Covering experimental treatments often saved money over time. When innovative procedures were covered early in their development, they often became standard treatments that were less expensive than prolonged traditional care for terminal conditions. Dr. Richardson, who had delivered the devastating diagnosis to the Patterson family, became a leading researcher in pediatric oncology experimental treatments. His work directly benefited from the increased insurance coverage that resulted from Elvis's advocacy, allowing him to conduct larger clinical trials and develop more effective treatments. Elvis's letter didn't just save Tommy Patterson, Dr. Richardson often said in his lectures. It saved every child who has benefited from experimental treatments that are now covered by insurance. The ripple effect of that single letter is still saving lives today. The legal precedent established by Elvis's approach influenced court cases across the country. Lawyers representing families fighting insurance denials began citing the Patterson case as evidence that insurance companies had a moral and legal obligation to cover life-saving treatments, regardless of their experimental status. Federal healthcare policy was also shaped by the principles Elvis had articulated in his letter. The concept that insurance companies should not be able to deny coverage based solely on cost considerations became a fundamental principle in healthcare legislation, influencing laws that protected patient rights and expanded access to innovative treatments. International healthcare systems took notice of the American insurance reforms that followed Elvis's intervention. Countries with nationalized healthcare systems began studying the Patterson Protocol as a model for balancing innovation with accessibility in their own medical coverage policies. The corporate world beyond healthcare was also influenced by Elvis's approach to advocacy. Business schools began teaching the Elvis method as an example of how public pressure could force corporate accountability. The case demonstrated that companies could be held responsible for the social impact of their policies, not just their legal compliance. Public relations professionals studied Elvis's strategy as a masterclass in effective advocacy communication. His letter combined emotional appeal with factual arguments, personal stories with systemic analysis, and moral pressure with practical solutions. The approach became a template for advocacy campaigns across many industries. The entertainment industry was particularly influenced by Elvis's example of using celebrity influence for systemic change rather than just charitable giving. Many performers began taking more strategic approaches to their advocacy work, focusing on policy changes that could help more people than individual donations or awareness campaigns. Elvis himself was changed by the experience of fighting Consolidated Health Insurance. He began taking a more systematic approach to his charitable work, focusing on issues where his influence could create lasting policy changes rather than just providing temporary relief. The success of the Patterson case led Elvis to become involved in other healthcare advocacy efforts. He worked with organizations fighting for better mental health coverage, improved access to experimental treatments for rare diseases, and reforms in how insurance companies handled pre-existing conditions. Elvis's approach to healthcare advocacy influenced his music as well. He began incorporating more songs about social justice and community responsibility into his performances. His rendition of "If I Can Dream" became a regular part of his concerts, often dedicated to families fighting for medical coverage and healthcare workers advocating for their patients. The Patterson family's gratitude to Elvis extended beyond personal appreciation to active advocacy. Linda Patterson became a full-time patient advocate, helping other families navigate insurance appeals and fight for coverage. Her work directly helped hundreds of families access experimental treatments that their insurance companies had initially denied. Robert Patterson used his experience with medical bankruptcy to start a nonprofit organization that provided financial assistance and advocacy support to families facing similar crises. The Patterson Family Foundation, as it came to be known, offered interest-free loans, legal assistance, and emotional support to families fighting insurance denials. Tommy Patterson's decision to become a pediatric nurse was directly inspired by his experience as a patient and his gratitude for Elvis's intervention. As an adult working in healthcare, Tommy often encountered families facing the same crisis his family had experienced, and he was able to guide them through the appeals process and connect them with advocacy resources. "I became a nurse because I wanted to be the person who helps families the way Elvis helped mine," Tommy often explained to colleagues. "Every time I help a family get coverage for their child's treatment, I'm continuing the work that Elvis started with his letter." The medical team that treated Tommy also became advocates for insurance reform. Nurses, doctors, and social workers who witnessed the impact of Elvis's intervention began speaking out about the need for systemic changes in how experimental treatments were covered. Hospital social workers began receiving training in insurance advocacy, learning how to help families fight denials and access resources for experimental treatments. The Patterson approach became standard practice in pediatric oncology centers across the country. The insurance industry itself was fundamentally changed by Elvis's intervention. The fear of facing similar public exposure led companies to proactively reform their experimental treatment policies. Industry conferences began featuring sessions on patient advocacy and corporate social responsibility. Insurance executives who had been working in the industry during the Patterson case often became advocates for reform within their own companies. They understood the public relations risks of denying coverage for life-saving treatments and worked to develop more patient-friendly policies. The actuarial science that drives insurance decision-making was also influenced by the Patterson case. Risk assessments began incorporating the potential public relations costs of denying coverage for sympathetic cases, leading to more nuanced approaches to experimental treatment coverage. Consumer advocacy organizations used Elvis's success as a model for fighting corporate injustice in other industries.
The strategy of combining moral arguments with strategic pressure was applied to fights against predatory lending, environmental destruction, and workplace safety violations. Educational institutions began teaching the Patterson case as an example of effective advocacy in courses on public policy, business ethics, and social justice. The case demonstrated how individual action could create systemic change when properly strategic and morally grounded. Research institutions studying healthcare accessibility often cited the Patterson case as a turning point in patient advocacy. The case showed how celebrity involvement could amplify advocacy efforts and create changes that benefited far more people than the original case that triggered the intervention.
The psychological impact of Elvis's intervention extended beyond the families directly affected by insurance policy changes. The case gave hope to families facing similar crises, demonstrating that powerful advocates could emerge from unexpected places and that systemic injustices could be overcome through strategic action. Support groups for families dealing with childhood cancer began sharing the Patterson story as an example of successful advocacy. The case provided a roadmap for families fighting insurance denials and inspired them to persist through lengthy appeals processes. The spiritual impact of Elvis's intervention was also significant for many people. The case demonstrated that compassion could triumph over corporate indifference, that individual action could create collective change, and that using privilege and influence to help others was both possible and powerful. Religious organizations began citing the Patterson case in sermons and teachings about social justice and moral responsibility. The story became an example of how people with resources and influence could live out values of compassion and service in practical ways. The Patterson case also influenced healthcare journalism, with reporters becoming more aware of the human impact of insurance policies and more willing to investigate corporate practices that affected patient care. Medical journalism began focusing more on the intersection of healthcare and social justice. Policy researchers studying healthcare reform often pointed to the Patterson case as evidence that individual advocacy could be more effective than legislative action in creating rapid change. The case demonstrated how public pressure could motivate corporate policy changes faster than regulatory processes. The international healthcare community also took notice of the American insurance reforms that followed Elvis's intervention. Healthcare systems in other countries began studying the Patterson Protocol as a potential model for their own experimental treatment coverage policies. Medical ethics education was influenced by the Patterson case, with professors using Elvis's letter as an example of how moral arguments could be effectively combined with practical considerations to create ethical policy changes. The case became a standard part of medical ethics curricula. The technology industry, which was beginning to develop electronic health records and insurance processing systems, incorporated lessons from the Patterson case into their designs. Systems were created to flag cases that might require special consideration and to streamline appeals processes for experimental treatments. Today, when families facing insurance denials for experimental treatments receive coverage, they often don't realize they're benefiting from changes that began with one letter from a rock and roll singer who refused to accept that a child's life wasn't worth saving. The legacy of that letter continues to save lives, change policies, and remind us all that the most powerful force for change is still someone who cares enough to act when others need help most. The transformation that began with Tommy Patterson's crisis and Elvis's response continues to influence healthcare policy, insurance practices, and patient advocacy efforts around the world. It serves as a permanent reminder that individual action, when properly focused and strategically executed, can create changes that benefit countless people for generations to come. Have you ever had to fight an insurance company for coverage you needed? Have you witnessed someone use their influence to help others who couldn't help themselves? Share your story in the comments, because just like Elvis showed with his letter to Consolidated Health Insurance, sometimes the most important thing we can do is refuse to accept injustice when we have the power to change it.